Chapter 27 The Ivy and the Plinth. The tattered and disjointed remains of Sterling's troop were easily corralled down the slope of the hill, though many continued to fire quick, errant shots back into the horde of pursuing coyotes as they went. Those who survived the routing found cover on a wide granite promontory built atop a large pile of massive boulders. The ruins of a felled tower were here, only the foundation remained. As Curtis sprinted towards this refuge, ducking a fresh hail of gunfire from the coyote fusiliers, he saw Sterling waving him forward. "Come on!" he cried. "Quickly!" He shot up the broken staircase and threw himself down on the stone floor of the promontory. A short rock wall, the scant remnants of an ancient foundation, made a kind of low palisade around the edge, and it was behind this that the small troop of irregulars found cover. Behind them, the ground fell away to a deep ravine. Curtis crawled to the wall and peeked out over the top. The sloping hillside was awash with coyote soldiers, a seemingly endless supply, pouring down from the ridge above. Their space held around 50 bandits and farmers, sitting with their backs pressed to the wall. They took turns popping up over the edge of the wall and firing into the onslaught of coyotes. The close air was sharp with the smell of sweat and gunpowder. A bandit, his leg badly wounded, was being comforted by a fellow soldier in the corner of the foundation. The grim, streaked faces Curtis saw inside the low wall of the ruined building were sorrow-laden, and the troop desperately demoralized. The approaching coyotes heeded their captain's orders and dug in behind whatever cover was available to them in the terraced sculpture garden. Their numbers grew and grew as more reinforcements, freed from fighting, joined their compatriots on the hillside. The tree branches became leaden with the weight of the scores of black crows watching the scene play out from above. One of the coyote captains stuck his head from behind his cover and cried out, "You're surrounded! Give yourself up! There's nowhere for you to go!" Sterling, his back against the edge of the wall next to the staircase, eyed the huddled group of farmers and bandits. "Well, folks," he said, "it's come down to this." He paused, his clawed fingers working over the handle of his pruning shears. "I don't blame you if you want to give yourself up. Any man, woman, or animal who wants to do that, I suggest you go now." No one moved. The distant sound of gunfire could be heard up over the ridge. Sterling nodded. "All right, then. Unto the breach it is." The gathering remnants of the Wildwood irregulars nodded in agreement. The fox took a deep breath. "On my mark," he said. 1, 2. "My king!" shouted a voice from behind Prue. She turned to see a bandit sprinting to their side from among the clashing soldiers in the basin of the clearing. Prue had Brendan's head cradled in her lap, and she was using all the strength she could conjure to hold the blood-soaked hoodie to the fallen bandit king's deep wound. "What happened?" asked the bandit frantically. A shot. I don't know where from," Prue sputtered. "A bullet in his shoulder." She peeled her jacket away to reveal the torn fabric of his shirt, saturated with blood, clinging to the skin of his chest. The bandit grimaced. "Hold on," he said. He reached into a leather bag at his hip and pulled out a little bottle. Dripping a few droplets of a hazel-brown liquid onto the clutch of torn ivy leaves, he packed the poultice against Brendan's shoulder, using Prue's sweatshirt as a secondary bandage. Brendan winced when the liquid came in contact with the open wound, and the bandit grabbed his hand and gripped it. "Breathe into the pain, Brendan," the bandit said calmly, the battle still raging behind him. He looked up at Prue. "Erigeron cinnamon," he explained. "Strong stuff. Should help with the bleeding." Brendan's eyes were fluttering as he battled to stay conscious against the rush of pain. "I've got to go," said Prue. "Stay with him?" She knew that Alexandra would be moving on the plinth. There was no one left to stop her. The bandit nodded, and Prue jumped up, running for the stone staircase to the 3rd tier. She leapt the stairs 2 at a go, until she made the top of the slope and her feet met the tangled carpet of ivory. In the middle of the clearing, Alexandra was dismounting from her horse and pulling the wailing baby from the leather saddlebag. The plinth, its base all snaked with ivy, stood in the center of the square. Prue stood at the top of the stairs and opened her mouth to scream. "Alexandra?" The voice had not been hers. Instead, it came from the other side of the clearing. Prue, her mouth clapped closed, stared across the wide, ivy-strewn plaza to see Iphigenia, the elder mystic, making her way down through the dense ground cover towards the governess. "Put the baby down," she demanded. The governess stifled a laugh. "Iphigenia," she said archly. "Dear Iphigenia, I should have known that your hand was in this little mess you set for my armies. Those poor farmers you've sent to their deaths. Well, you've arrived just in time. The ceremony will soon be complete." "You will only mark yourself a murderess," said Iphigenia flatly. "I am freeing a natural force from its imposed slumber," replied Alexandra, "allowing it to once again assume its prior dominance in the wild world. To a godless naturalist such as yourself, this must seem a real setting to rights." "It will consume you when it's finished tearing down every tree in the forest. Don't think you're immune. And the coyotes, that innocent species you've conscripted, do they know the true consequences? Have you told them that their warrens will be invaded, their waiting broods, their wives and pups smothered?" "Psh!" dismissed the governess. "Those hapless dogs. The illusion of power is enough for them. I've given them more in the last 15 years than they've ever enjoyed in the history of their breed. When they're extinguished, at least they'll die an elevated species. As for me, I wouldn't concern yourself with my outcome. I'll have slept the ivy long before it can get its vines around me." Iphigenia frowned, her face set in worry. "Don't assume it's so easy to control. Once you started this wheel in motion, there's no stopping." The governess laughed. "Can I assume that I have your sanction, then, to continue? Or are you going to keep distracting me from the task at hand?" The mystic spoke, but Prue couldn't make out the words. It was something intoned to herself, as if she was assuring herself of her own beliefs. The governess looked at her askance, before striding the short distance to the waiting plinth. With her free hand, she drew a long dagger from her belt. Prue, desperate, jumped forward. "Please, Alexandra," she cried. "Don't do this!" Alexandra stopped and looked over at Prue. She flared her eyes. "Please, if you don't mind," she said. "I hadn't expected an audience. This is a great moment for me. I'd like it to not be ruined by the miserable mewlings of a little girl and an old woman." "That's my brother you've got there," said Prue. "That's my parents' only son. You don't know how much it would break their hearts." "Then they shouldn't have made the deal," replied Alexandra. "They were foolish, those outsiders. But they certainly knew what they wanted. They wanted you." Here the dowager governess pointed the knife at Prue. "And so they got you. Congratulations, you were born. I held up my side of the bargain. Come to think of it, if anyone is truly responsible for your brother's death and your parents' heartbreak, it's you. Your very existence, your parents' need for your existence, is the true root of this entire debacle. I'm merely a player in the drama." She moved a few more feet towards the plinth. She was now within a few yards. "Would you have fed Alexei to the ivy in order to assume such power?" This came from Iphigenia, her voice firm. The governess froze. "Would you?" pressed the elder mystic. "He was a baby once, I'm sure you recall. Such a beautiful child, that one." The color rose in Alexandra's pale face, and she turned angrily toward Iphigenia. I told you, old woman, not to distract me from my purpose. You both are becoming quite irritating. Poor Alexei, said Iphigenia. Not even your magic could bring him back into the world of the living. But I did, shouted Alexandra, her temper finally raised. I gave him life twice. I'd breathed life into that body once. Why not a second time? Why should that be any different? It was his choice to die the second time. He could not appreciate the labor that I underwent to give him new life each time. My idiot nephew and his underlings gave him his second death. They killed him, and they used his death as a motive to throw me from power. And so they will pay. They will pay with their lives and their families' lives. The governess regained her composure, her dagger at the ready. Mac was still crying in her arms, his face a deep red. It's really that simple. Prue, unmoored from her fears, leapt forward at a sprint and dove into the space between Alexandra and the plinth, pressing her back against the cold stone of the short edifice. Stop! She yelled. Rage distorted Alexandra's porcelain features. She whipped the dagger in a clean arc across her body, slapping Prue on the cheek with the flat of the blade. The force of the blow sent Prue cartwheeling sideways into the plush tangle of ivy. A sharp flush of pain burned at her cheek. A trickle of blood wet her lip. Do not, Alexandra said forcefully. Do not keep me from my task. The sun had reached its zenith. It was noon. Prue could feel the ivy moving slowly underneath her. 3, intoned the fox. The ragtag remnants of the Wildwood irregulars on the stone outcrop let out a collective howl and leapt from their concealed positions behind the low stone wall. A barrage of bullets and gunpowder filled the air as they began this final assault. Curtis whipped his saber from his scabbard and went bounding down the flight of stairs with a terrific holler. The wall of coyote soldiers before them stood up from their cover and took aim at the advancing soldiers. The crows in the neighboring trees launched from their perches and dove towards the fray. A bandit sprinting next to Curtis took a bullet in his chest and fell back in a spray of dirt. Another farmer tumbled to the ground, an arrow lodged in his furry gullet. Curtis braced himself as he ran, ready for the hit that would send him to the soil. Time slowed to a near stop. Yep! Yep! Curtis looked up to see a vast fleet of eagles as they coursed over the irregulars' heads, diving down from the air behind the promontory. The pale gray sky was obliterated by an ocean of birds in flight. The avians! Shouted Sterling. The wave of flyers crashed into the descending crows. The crows' terrible caws of fear and pain profaned the air above the fighters on the ground, all of whom had stopped their warring, spellbound to watch the amazing scene play out overhead. More birds came from the south, a tide of falcons and osprey, owls and kestrels, filling the sky. Their manifold voices, chiming their cumulative battle cry, was deafening. Sterling was the first to shake himself from shock. Let's move in, he shouted, and the irregulars, renewed, continued their advance. The army of birds dispatched the crows in short order. Those who weren't torn apart by the raptors' fierce talons fled into the surrounding woods as fast as their wings could fly them. The bird army turned their force to the coyotes below. The coyotes, petrified by this new army that threatened them, were caught trying to choose which advancing force to engage. Those who aimed their rifles into the blur of wings above them were cut down by the farmers and bandits who dove into their ranks on the ground. One coyote, his eyes set on Curtis, dove into the fight, cutlass flashing. Curtis threw the blade of his saber up defensively, feeling the weight of his opponent's weapon crashing into his own. No sooner had he done this than a pair of gnarled yellow claws appeared at the coyote's shoulders, and the animal was lifted skyward in the clutches of an enormous golden eagle. Curtis tumbled backward into a pile of dead leaves, and watching the bird and his catch grow distant in the sky, he let out a loud, victorious whoop. The air soon became a cloud of wheeling raptors, diving to the ground to pick up more hapless coyote soldiers, and returning to the air, only to drop them to their deaths on the ground below. After a time, avoiding this aerial assault of falling coyotes became more of a concern to the Wildwood irregulars on the ground than actually fighting. More birds crested the ridge, and the forces, the conjoined irregulars and avians, cleared the hillside of coyotes and made their advance on the ridge. The governess heard the eagle's call. Her face whipped upwards, staring at the sky. The sound was unearthly, 1,000 birds crying out at once. Prue pushed herself up and scanned the horizon for the source of the noise. "The birds," whispered Alexandra to herself angrily. "The cursed birds!" The governess redoubled her focus on the task before her. Mac squirmed against her clutches as she placed him roughly on the headstone of the plinth, his wails melding with the screams of the birds in the distance. Holding him flat with one hand, the governess began her ritual. Her lips began to move, intoning the guttural sound of some ancient incantation. With the tip of the dagger, she drew forth a single bulb of blood from the baby's outstretched palm. Max screamed. Prue let out an impassioned yelp and tried to lift herself from the ground, but discovered she couldn't move. The ivy had intertwined itself around her legs and wrists. She was pinned to the clearing floor. Prue's mind raced as she struggled against the rippling vines of ivy. The tree branches above her swayed in the cold breeze, indifferent to the horror about to play out below. If only they would stop her, she thought. If only you would reach down your boughs. The governess lifted Mac's body from the plinth with her left hand, her fingers clutching the cloth of his jumper, and held him high in the air. The dagger in her right hand flashed momentarily in a brief break of sun. The blood on Mac's palm dripped down his fingers, poised to fall at his fingertip to the ivy below. "Stop now," came a voice. It was Brendan, standing on the top of the stairs. His yew bow was stretched taut, an arrow knocked in the string and held to his cheek. His eyes squinted down the shaft of the arrow as he took aim at his target. His face was drained of color, and the front of his shirt soaked a dark red. Alexandra turned to the bandit and cracked a smile. "Too late, O king of bandits," she said. She raised the dagger to strike. "If only you would," thought Prue. "Please, my brother." Suddenly, a dark shape swept across the wide plaza, casting a moving shadow over the expanse of quivering green below. Prue looked up and saw that it was a pair of long, spindly fir boughs, arcing mightily towards the governess's extended hand. Her attention momentarily distracted by Brendan and his drawn bow, she didn't see the boughs as they descended on the baby in her hand. In a quick motion, they'd snatched Mac from her grip and carried him aloft. Alexandra shrieked, twisting as she grabbed for the baby's feet. Brendan released his arrow. It sank home between Alexandra's shoulder blades. The ivy licked greedily at her ankles. A single drop of blood fell from the wound the arrow had made, falling to spatter against the leaves of the ivy vines. The dagger fell from her fingers. The dowager governess followed the droplet of her blood into the awaiting tongues of the ivy vines, and the entire glade of dark green leaves surged forward, consuming her long body in the span of a few short seconds. Mac, cradled high above the scene in the spiny fingers of the fir boughs, cried fitfully. The ivy quavered around Prue, its spiny tendrils still holding her fast. She screamed, terrified the ivy would consume her next. Iphigenia called out to Brendan from across the clearing. "Bandit King, you fed the ivy. They've feasted on the governess herself," she shouted. "The plant is in your thrall. You must command it to sleep." A flicker of recognition flashed across Brendan's tired face. Prue could see the realization pass fleetingly through his mind. He now had control of the most powerful force in the wood. But no sooner had the idea occurred to him than he had cracked his bloodied lips wide and intoned the simple command. "Sleep." The ivy immediately stopped its pulsing movement and relaxed into the floor of the square, its many leaves twitching like a sleeper on the edge of slumber. In a moment, the glade had ceased movement entirely. The vines around Prue's wrists and legs released their powerful grip, and she tore at them, quickly freeing herself from their bounds. The bandit king, as if heeding his own command, slumped to the ground in a pile, his bow clattering across the paving stones at the top of the stair. Iphigenia held a single hand above her head and gestured to the high branches of the fir tree. Prue watched as the tree complied with the mystic's request, dropping Mac gingerly from bough to bough like a multitude of hands juggling a delicate bauble slowly to the ground. Once the tree's freight had arrived at its lowest branch, the limbs swung wide again, curving across the wide glade to deposit the baby softly into the lap of his sister. Prue threw her arms around her brother and squeezed him tight to her chest. "Mac!" she cried. "I've got you!" The baby, recognizing his sister's voice, held back his crying and stared up at her. "Pooh!" he said finally. The tears came flooding as Prue kissed the soft skin on his brow over and over. Mac babbled merrily in her arms. The quiet scene didn't last long. A loud groan sounded from the far side of the clearing. "Brendan!" Prue shouted, remembering her friend. She ran towards his prone body, sprawled over the top 2 steps of the stone staircase. The ivy-leaf poultice the bandit had made was barely clinging to his shoulder, and it was apparent that the act of drawing the bow and firing the arrow had opened the wound afresh. Brendan's eyelids were closed, though Prue could see his pupils moving underneath the thin veil of skin, as if he were searching for something, desperately, in the darkness of his unconsciousness. "Help!" she yelled. "The king needs help!" A broad swirl of gray and brown birds wheeled above the middle tier, and the ground was littered with discarded weapons and fallen soldiers. The surviving irregulars and the seemingly endless tide of birds continued to pick off the last of the coyotes as the governess's defeated army beat a retreat, the coyotes falling to their forelegs to run, casting off the coarse fabric of their uniforms as they went. The south ridge of the clearing still smoldered from the artillery barrage, and a great mantle of smoke hung over the ruined city. Prue heard someone approach. It was the elder mystic. "Let me see," she said, her voice calm. She knelt down at Brendan's side and inspected the wound beneath the poultice. She said. "Blood loss, some flesh, chance of infection." She lifted the king up by the shoulder and looked at his back. "An exit wound. It's gone clean through. That's good. Here." She reached over and tore a long swath of fabric from the hem of her robe sleeve and set about packing it against the wound. The pain of the mystic's work woke Brendan from his unconsciousness, and his eyes flew open, wide and bloodshot. He grasped at his shoulder. Iphigenia held him down. "Easy, king," she said. "You've had a bit of a hurt. Nothing major, but you surely shouldn't have been playing archer." There was a clatter of footsteps on the staircase. Curtis, flanked by several of his fellow Wildwood irregulars, was leaping up the stairs. "Prue!" he shouted. "Prue, you won't believe what's happened. It's all so—" He stopped short and stared at the baby in Prue's arms. A wide grin broke his face. "Mac," he said. "You got him." "Yep," said Prue. "I've got him." He went to hug her, but was again distracted by the body of the bandit king below him. "Brendan," he said. "How is he? Is he okay? What happened?" Iphigenia, trussing the king's shoulder with a bit of tawny fabric, nodded. "He'll be all right. Might be laid up for a bit. He won't be robbing any stagecoaches any time soon, but he'll heal in time. Important thing is that we get him to the circle of caravans quickly. There are people there who can see to his wounds." The several irregulars standing next to Curtis vaulted forward at Iphigenia's request and hoisted Brendan into a standing position between their shoulders. They walked him off towards the glade. The elder mystic wiped her hands on the hem of her robe while Curtis sat down on the top step next to Prue, who was staring down at the child in her arms. Her brow was furrowed, as if she was mulling over some important puzzle. "Pooh!" the baby was saying. "I can't believe it," Curtis said quietly. "We did it." He reached out his arms to the baby, and Prue smiled, handing him the child. He bounced Mac on his knee, and the baby squealed happily. Prue squinted over at Iphigenia. "That was amazing," she said. "Really incredible. If you hadn't convinced the tree branches to swoop in and grab him, who knows what would have happened? Iphigenia nodded thoughtfully. Indeed. She shifted a little in her seat and added, But I didn't ask them. Prue looked back at her blankly. It hadn't occurred to me, actually. I was distracted in the moment, as the Dowager was, by the arrival of the Bandit King. The trees, they seem to have done it of their own accord, which is very strange. Or, she paused, they answered the request of someone else. But that is highly, highly implausible. Prue shyly looked down at her shoes. So, what happened to the Dowager? Curtis interjected, gesturing over at the glade of ivy behind them. There was no sign of Alexandra's body. It was as if she had vanished completely. She is part of the ivy now, dear, replied the mystic. A fate this baby has narrowly avoided. Does that mean she's, dead? Prue asked. Iphigenia shook her head. Oh, no, she said. Not dead. Very much alive. But certainly incapacitated. The elder mystic searched for the right words. She's simply changed form. Her every molecule has been absorbed by this plant, which is now returned to its soporific, I think, means sleeping, I believe, state. Quite incapacitated. Iphigenia looked off into the distance thoughtfully. I suppose now that you mention it, there would be a way to... Well, hello, look who's coming to see us. At the bottom of the steps, a contingent of the avian army had gathered. The largest of them, a golden eagle, stepped forward and climbed the first few steps of the staircase. Is one of you Prue McKeel? Asked the eagle. Prue looked up. I am. The eagle bowed low. My name is Devram. I'm the acting general of the avian infantry. I understand you were flown 2 days ago by another eagle such as myself. Yes, she said. We were shot down. He didn't survive. The eagle's face was stoic. It is as we feared. Prue's heart sank as she began to stammer a desperate apology. All the calamity that she'd brought to these poor animals. But before she could speak, Iphigenia seemed to guess at her troubles and stepped forward. Good general, said Iphigenia. How did you hear word of our predicament? A sparrow, replied the general. A young sparrow named Enver. He took particular interest in the young outsider girl. He sought news from the birds of Wildwood as a way to follow the girl's progress. When the Dowager's army had amassed and began marching south, the news traveled very quickly. We knew that we had to intercede. Alas, the general pecked at the underside of his wing thoughtfully, as a man might stroke his beard. Our numbers are fairly small. The persecutions of Southwood have badly diminished our standing. The elder mystic nodded. Perhaps then, she said, our work is not complete. She turned to Prue and Curtis, sneaking her fingers into the crooks of their arms and standing up. Help me down the stairs, little ones, she said. I've got an idea I'd like to put to the good general. I've a mind to set some things right. We do have an army at our disposal, after all.